Let me take you back to my final year as an undergraduate. I won't tell you which year, but film buffs might be able to work out from what I'm about to say. So imagine a group of students assemble, eager for the introduction to the first lecture in this new module on organometallic cluster compounds. But on the screen, we do not immediately see pictures of molecules. The lecturer starts by saying that he had been to the cinema recently and seen this must-see new film, Superman. Remember, you'll believe a man can fly. The start of that film took us to the distant planet of Krypton, where the baby Superman was about to be cast adrift in a spacecraft. The only hope for that race, as its planet or its society was about to disintegrate. I can't remember those details. And so we are treated to a picture of the spacecraft as it leaves its doomed homeworld. And at that point, my lecturer told us, he noticed that the shape of the spacecraft was a polystellated icosahedron, precisely the same shape as some of those molecules he would be introducing us to. Now, I only remember a few more snippets from that original film way back. Of course, Superman, weren't we told, was supposed to be faster than a speeding bullet. And there is that memory of when the growing super lad is testing his developing abilities and merely runs alongside as fast as a speeding train. Movie trivia. There's an older couple whose daughter, they are as a family on that train, and the daughter points out at Superman as he's running alongside. The mum and dad there were played by the actress and actor who way back in the original movie series and radio show played the original Superman and Lois Lane. The girl in the train who's pointing at Superman is supposed to be a younger Lois Lane too. And of course, she was destined later on to meet Clark Kent. Oh yes, and he was destined to save her life, wasn't he? Fast forward a decade or so to when Clark Kent is a reporter on the Daily Planet, and an older Lois Lane suffers what you might perhaps describe as a helicopter mishap. You might remember this mishap, this snippet from the film too. Why the helicopter plunged onto the top of that skyscraper, I don't really remember that. But there is Lois dangling one-handed from the helicopter runner over the top edge of the building with nothing but air between her and the, sorry, Americanism here, sidewalk some 1,000 feet below. And Clark Kent, with his secret supervision, spies her predicament from ground level, quickly goes into his famous twirl, not as I thought, a phone booth, but it was a rotating door, to emerge for the first time as the superhero himself. And not a moment too soon, Lois's grip finally gives way, and she starts to fall to her inevitable death, only to be caught in midair. Do you remember the dialogue at that point? He says, "Easy, miss, I've got you." And her reply, "You've got me, who's got you?" Very, very good question, isn't it? Not just for the fictitious potential couple, but for life generally. How come this guy in the blue spandex can stay suspended in midair, totally contrary to our normal understanding of human aerodynamics? Normally, something needs to be supported by something else that is stable. Yes, you can have an amazing tower of bricks, think Jenga. You can have those wind sculptures in the Wild West, which I found out on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire recently, are called hoodoos. But no matter how precarious it might appear, it all rests on a secure foundation, or it eventually tumbles. So what kind of foundation would you say that you have for your life? If someone were to ask you Lois Lane's question, who's got you? Well, what would your answer be? How well founded is your foundation? And you might think immediately of that little word picture that Jesus gave at the end of what we call his Sermon on the Mount. Foundations feature very heavily, or in one case, not heavily enough, in that little story. First, here is a house with a foundation. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain came, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. And then the opposite, as the dramatic finale to the sermon drives Jesus' point home rivetingly. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. We shouldn't be able to miss the take-home message. What's the contrast? It depends on what we do with the words of Jesus. Not just hear them, but do them or not do them. That's the difference. But today I'd like to take us way further back in the Bible to Abraham, where we will find a similar insistence on the need for foundations for life. And yet not back to Genesis, where we see the account of Abraham laid out, but in that New Testament book we call Hebrews, in a chapter that sometimes gets called the Gallery of the Faithful or something like that, Hebrews chapter 11. I think it makes sense to take the traditional understanding of this book, that it's written to disciples of Jesus Christ in a society which was starting to become less favorable to them. The ultimate levels of persecution have not yet kicked in. Hebrews 12, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Not yet. But things are definitely getting uncomfortable for the followers of Jesus. So why not, the temptation would be, why not get back to the Jewish roots of that faith? Why not slip back into the calmer waters of the Jewish religion that was officially tolerated by the Roman state and afforded protections that this new group naming the name of Jesus had not yet been granted? So the writer of this letter, time and time again, insists that there is actually an awful lot of clear water between Judaism and what I think I prefer to call faith in Christ rather than simply Christianity. Jesus is better on every score. He's superior to angels. He's a better high priest than Aaron. His sacrifice of himself is better than all the millions of animals whose blood had been shed in the temple at Jerusalem. By this point in the letter, we've had 10 chapters of those betters stacked up. Oh, and a not totally trivial further point to consider too, in Hebrews 8, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So probably Hebrews is written only a very few months or years before the Jewish temple is blitzed by the Romans. So our question today, who's got you, is really pertinent. Judaism is seen as a lifeboat, but it's a lifeboat with holes. It's not a safe place to hide. It will shortly sink. There is no safe foundation to be had there. But throughout its history, Judaism has featured people of faith. It had become a system of mere religion and ritual. Was that what it was really all about? It turns out that it was never really intended to be all about those outward rituals. It always has been at heart something about faith in the true and living God. And that's what the writer highlights for us in this chapter 11. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. That was always how it worked, right from the start. Abel, Enoch, Noah, people like that, right back in those earliest chapters of the Bible, they were people of faith. Here's what it says about Noah, for example, in verse 7. He became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. And Abraham, the next one in chronological order too, him as well. What did he do? What kind of practical faith in the true and living God did he show? Well, we've got that in verse 8, where we started our reading. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. You can totally understand Lois Lane's comment there, can't you? Who's got you? There's no obvious security or foundation there in what Abraham's going to do. He starts as probably a reasonably well-to-do resident of and he gives it all up. Maybe he sells it all up to fund this expedition into, well, the middle of nowhere, really. Imagine people asking him what he's up to. Where is he going? How are they going to react to his answer? Well, I don't know, really. Hopefully I'll know when I get there. But what did he have, though? Was it just wishful thinking? I think we need to read on and see that there is some kind of promise involved. The word comes up twice in this verse and a few more times soon afterwards as well. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. So first of all, it's the right land, but the wrong time. It's going to be something like 500 years later when Abraham's descendants would finally receive that land. And actually, at this earlier point, descendants is a very live issue for Abraham. He and his wife were old and childless, so surely it's impossible. But no. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Look, there's that word promise again, as well as that little phrase by faith. So it's because of the promise, or is it? Perhaps we should be a bit picky here. It wasn't just because Abraham and Sarah had been given a promise, but because of who it was that was giving that promise. Come back to our mid-air super clinch again. If it was anyone else saying, easy, miss, I've got you, it would be worthless. But who's got you would be precisely the right answer if it was anyone else. See, a promise is only as good as the person who makes it. Would you, for example, buy a used car from either of these guys? But if it is Superman in the film, Lois is safe. And if it is God saying descendants and homeland to Abraham and Sarah, they're on safe ground. Now, it's not a very flattering description we read here about Abraham's potential as the head of a new people, but it's accurate and it's amazing. Verse 12, therefore from one man, him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Now, when I said that in believing God's promise, Abraham and Sarah are on safe ground, did you notice I was deliberately using the concept of foundations in the metaphor I chose? And Hebrews uses the word foundations too. Verse 10. Talking of Abraham again, he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Because this is the true and living God we're talking about, his words bear infinite weight. His words are infinitely dependable. They are a foundation upon which we can build, upon which we can risk everything. But actually, doesn't it look as if Abraham is looking for more than just simply the fulfillment of God's promise about a literal earthly homeland for literal descendants? There's something about a city. What's this city that we're reading about? A city of total security, surely. If God himself has planned not just its architecture, but its foundations. So what's that? We have to read on again. And first, there's a summary, just a note, if we even needed one, just stating it for the record, that Abraham and Sarah never saw the fulfillment of that promise, but they acted upon it. Their attitude to life was changed by it. Verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Not strangers and exiles in the sense of wanting to go back home to to family there. It still remained a possibility, but it was one they did not choose. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they'd been thinking of that land from which they'd gone out, they would have had opportunity to return, but they didn't, not at all. They're actually looking for something out of this world. Verse 16. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. But even now, though that's a wonderful desire, just because it's a desire, that doesn't make it open to us, does it? Not just because we want it. They can only hope for this because God has given them this promise. An invitation has been issued. And this next line I find really moving, because God's invitation is not grudging at all. It is the very opposite of grudging. It is gracious. It is amazingly gracious. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. I think that is a deliberate use of a figure of speech we have in English, where you deny the opposite to actually make something more clear and firm and strong. God is not ashamed means actually God is delighted. God is proud. God almost, we could say, considers himself honored to be called their God. We are called as guests. We do not need to build this city ourselves. And it's always that way with this true and living God. He gives to us. You get in that those complex chapters towards the end of the book of Romans, this wonderful little question: who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? The obvious answer: no. No one has, because God is always the gracious benefactor, the gracious giver. So don't ever think that you come here, and by here I mean like this on Zoom, or when we hopefully finally get back into some physical event. Don't think that when you come here, you are doing God some kind of favor. He's not invited you to this city in order to boost his prestige by having such fine fellows and fellowesses as ourselves, as residents. He doesn't need your name or its following letters to dignify the executive of this church. He does not need to strike a deal with the returning prodigal to take him on as a member of staff. Remember how that story finished? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. But no, God will have none of that. This gracious God is insistent that you will be again a member not of his staff, but of his family. Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate, for this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And in that celebratory party, in that heavenly city, it's something that God himself insists he will be delighted to attend. Just so I tell you, said Jesus, there's joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Therefore, God is not ashamed. He is pleased, he is delighted to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. That was God's promise and God's invitation to Abraham, which Abraham responded to, as did all of those people of Hebrews 11, by faith. That's the promise and invitation to all of you too, to come by faith in Jesus Christ. And if you're not really sure enough of yourself that you could think to claim that you have, by faith, come to know this true and living God, let me finish with a verse which I've always found encouraging in those self-doubtful moments. Just as it isn't about us bringing stuff to God, but God preparing things for us, so it is with knowing God. Paul writing to the Galatian Christians, but now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, the emphasis is the other way around, to be known by God. Those Hebrews receiving the letter were encouraged by this description of the heavenly city. But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Now, if you have put your trust in Jesus Christ, you are part of that you. But you might think, that's a pretty heavy-duty few verses to finish off a sermon with. If that's how you think back to Lois Lane. Held secure in the arms of Superman, still 100 or so feet above the sidewalks of Metropolis. But with the question, who's got you, now safely answered. Let's pray, shall we?